What if the country America keeps calling broken is actually the one writing the rules for the next 50 years? Something does not add up here, and once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. Before we go further, if you want more videos that connect the dots nobody else is connecting, hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like button so this reaches more people, and send this to one friend who still thinks this war is simple. Okay, let's get into it. On the same day, two completely different stories were being told about Iran. In one story, told by the President of the United States on a podcast, Iran is finished. No Navy worth mentioning, no real Air Force, very few soldiers, no leadership left standing, an economy crushed under 250% inflation. If that is true, this should be the easiest war America has ever fought. But on that exact same morning, something else was happening thousands of miles away. Iran's Revolutionary Guard launched roughly 30 ballistic missiles and drones at Kuwait. They hit the airport. A civilian was killed. Dozens more were wounded. Commercial flights stopped completely. Iran's foreign ministry did not pause talks with Washington. They ended them. Not delayed, ended. And a senior military advisor to Iran's supreme leader stood up and promised that any further American aggression would be answered with, in his words, a barrage of missiles and drones. So which version is real? A broken country with no leadership and no military, or a country coordinated enough to strike an international airport, shut down commercial flights, cut off diplomacy, and issue a public threat, all within the same 24 hours? A country with no navy and no air force does not plan a synchronized missile and drone operation against a neighboring nation's largest airport on the very morning its enemy is telling the world it has already won. Coordination like that takes command structure, it takes intelligence, it takes people giving orders and other people following them precisely. Either the description of a broken, leaderless nation is wrong, or the attack we watched happen in real time was some kind of illusion. Both of these stories cannot be true at the same time. And today we are going to figure out which one actually matches reality, because I do not think the news channels covering this are asking the right question. They keep asking whether America can force Iran to surrender. That is the wrong question completely. The real question is simpler and much scarier. Is Iran turning into North Korea? And if it is, what does that mean for everyone else on this planet? To answer that, you need to understand something that almost nobody explains clearly. Why? Has the United States never attacked North Korea? Just sit with that question for a second. North Korea is poor. It has no oil. It has no major waterway that global trade depends on. On paper, the American military could dismantle North Korea's entire fighting force in a matter of days. And yet, it has never happened, and it never will. Not because North Korea is strong in any traditional sense, but because North Korea built something smarter than strength. It built a situation where attacking it costs far more than any possible gain. That is the whole trick. You do not need to be more powerful than a superpower. You just need to make the price of fighting you unbearable. And once you understand that idea, watch what Iran has been doing piece by piece, with a discipline that looks less like desperation and more like a plan that has been years in the making. There are 4 things North Korea did to reach that position. And right now, in real time, Iran appears to be working through the exact same 4 steps. The first step is real nuclear deterrence, not just the appearance of it. Before this war began, Iran was enriching uranium to 60%, which is technically close enough to weapons grade. But being close is not the same as having a weapon. Scientists call this hedging. You stand right at the edge without stepping over it. That is exactly why the strikes on Iran's nuclear sites happened when they did. The window was closing, and both Washington and Israel knew that once Iran actually built and tested a working device, there would be no more military options left on the table. Here is the twist nobody wants to say out loud. By attacking Iran before it had a finished weapon, the United States and Israel may have just handed Iran the strongest possible reason to finish building one. Think about what Iran has watched happen to other countries. Libya gave up its nuclear program voluntarily. Years later, its leader was overthrown and killed with Western support. Iraq had no nuclear weapons at all, and it was invaded, and its government destroyed. And now Iran, a country that was still sitting at the negotiating table, got bombed anyway. What lesson does any government draw from watching that pattern 3 times in a row? The lesson is brutal, but simple. The only thing that keeps a hostile superpower from invading you is a nuclear weapon you already have, not one you are hoping to build someday. A former American diplomat with decades of experience on Iran said plainly that Iran would now likely try to obtain an actual weapon, something that was not true before the war started. Read that twice. Before the bombing, Iran was hedging. After the bombing, that restraint may be gone completely. The very campaign designed to stop Iran from going nuclear may end up being the exact reason it finally does. Look at how this played out for North Korea. It tested its first real nuclear device in 2006. After that test, Threats from Washington stopped being threats and became something closer to careful statements. Because once a country has an actual deployed weapon, rather than just the potential for one, it has purchased something priceless, an insurance. Policy against invasion. So, when a politician announces that Iran has already agreed to give up nuclear weapons, understand what that claim is really asking you to believe. It is asking you to believe that Iran will voluntarily throw away the one lesson it has learned at enormous cost from watching Libya and Iraq. No government that has survived what Iran survived would give that up. It would be handing away its own survival. That is step one. Step two is cutting off diplomacy completely and drawing lines that cannot be crossed. North Korea did this years ago. It stopped negotiating with Washington, not to get a better deal, but because it had decided it wanted nothing from those talks at all. It even changed its own founding documents to remove the goal of ever reunifying peacefully with the South, permanently labeling its neighbor an enemy instead. That was not a bargaining chip. That was a country telling the world it had nothing left to lose from walking away. Now look at what Iran's foreign ministry did on that same chaotic day. It suspended every negotiation with the United States, and the condition for restarting talks was one that America almost certainly cannot meet: a total and permanent end to Israeli military operations in Gaza and Lebanon. Iran knows exactly what it is doing by setting that condition. It is not designed to be accepted. It is designed to be impossible, which means it functions as a wall, not a door. A senior Iranian lawmaker made the tone even clearer, saying they would negotiate only if necessary, but that they trusted no promises from a country they accused of committing brutal crimes against them. That is not the language of someone hoping to make a deal. That is the language of a side that has decided it stands completely alone and plans to act that way from now on. The third step is the one most people overlook entirely, and it is arguably the biggest. Iran is weaving itself deeply into a growing alliance with Russia and China, and this is not just about Iran's survival. It is part of a much larger, slower project, the gradual erosion of the system that has kept American power funded for half a century. In the 1970s, the United States struck a deal with Saudi Arabia that oil would be priced and sold in dollars worldwide. That single arrangement created constant global demand for American currency, because any nation wanting oil first needed dollars. That demand let America print money, run enormous deficits, and freeze the assets of anyone who defied it. Now watch this system being quietly dismantled. China currently buys close to a third of all of Iran's oil exports, and it is not paying in dollars. It is paying in its own currency. Every one of those transactions is a small crack in a wall that used to look unbreakable. Iran's domestic crypto exchange has processed a huge share of the country's digital transactions. In recent years, hundreds of millions of dollars move through channels that are extremely difficult for Washington to freeze or block. And on a larger scale, the expanding coalition of nations that now includes Iran alongside Russia, China, and others controls a massive share of global oil production, and they are actively building payment systems designed to replace the ones the West controls. Every piece of this is a brick in an alternative financial world being built quietly, brick by brick, transaction by transaction. Why does this matter through the North Korea lens? Because North Korea survived decades of crushing sanctions for one simple reason: China kept it breathing. Iran is building a version of that same lifeline, except far more advanced, spread across multiple countries and multiple currencies. And here's the uncomfortable irony in all of this. Every time Washington freezes assets, cuts a nation off from the global payment network, or launches another maximum pressure campaign, it teaches every other country watching the exact same lesson, that relying entirely on American financial infrastructure is dangerous. Nations far outside this conflict are taking notes. The very strategy meant to punish Iran is quietly pushing the rest of the world toward alternatives to the dollar. Think about what that actually means for the long run. Sanctions used to be a nearly unstoppable weapon precisely because there was no real alternative to the dollar system. A country cut off from that system was cut off from most of the modern global economy, full stop. But every new payment network, every new currency arrangement, every new digital settlement platform built outside American reach chips away at that monopoly a little more. It is slow. It is not dramatic. There is no single headline moment where the dollar's dominance ends, but the direction of travel is unmistakable. And Iran is one of the countries most actively pushing in that direction, because for Iran, this is not optional. It is survival. The fourth step is the most immediate one, and it explains exactly why 50% of a certain American missile stockpile has already vanished. This step is about making any military victory so expensive that it stops being worth pursuing at all. North Korea cannot match American firepower directly. So instead, it built one single, devastatingly credible threat. The South Korean capital sits within range of thousands, of North Korean artillery pieces. If war breaks out, that city could be devastated within hours. No American president has ever been willing to accept that outcome, which means the theoretical military advantage America holds has never actually mattered. Iran built its own version of that exact same threat, except on a global scale instead of a regional one. Through a narrow strait barely 20 miles wide at its tightest point flows roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas supply every single day. Japan depends on that passage for the overwhelming majority of its energy. So does India. So does China. When that passage is threatened, entire national economies start shaking. And Iran is not fighting with expensive equipment to hold that leverage. It is using drones that cost a fraction of what it costs America to shoot them down, sometimes needing 2 or 3 expensive interceptor missiles just to stop one cheap drone. That imbalance has already burned through roughly half of one key American missile stockpile. Half in a war that is supposedly already won. That is not losing. That is exactly what North Korea figured out decades ago. You do not fight a superpower on its terms. You make the fight so expensive on your terms that continuing it stops making sense. If you have made it this far, you already know this is not a topic anyone can fully explain in a 5-minute clip. So drop a comment telling me which of these 4 steps surprised you the most, because I genuinely read them, and this kind of conversation is exactly why this channel exists. And if this is opening your eyes even a little, subscribing costs nothing and helps this reach the people who need to see it too. Now, I want to step back even further, because what is happening with Iran is not just a story about one war, it is a symptom of something much older. And to understand it properly, we have to talk about Rome for a moment. I know that sounds like a detour while missiles are flying, but the patterns behind how empires rise and fall do not really change across centuries. Historians studying Rome's decline point to something fascinating. Rome was not destroyed primarily by outside enemies. It was slowly worn down from within by the enormous cost of holding an ever-expanding empire together, and critically, by the disappearance of a shared external threat. Once Rome finally crushed its 2 great rivals completely, something strange happened almost immediately afterward. Within just over a decade, Romans were turning on each other violently in their own capital. The thing that had held the empire together, a common enemy to unite against, was suddenly gone, and every internal tension that had been suppressed came rushing to the surface all at once. Does that sound familiar at all? When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, America lost its defining external rival. And in the decades since, the country has been turning inward in ways that keep intensifying. Deep political division, growing distrust between regions, and moments of internal unrest that would have been unthinkable a few generations earlier. Some analysts studying these patterns describe modern America as entering what they call a late stage, where the outward appearance of the system stays the same, but its actual function starts behaving very differently underneath. This does not mean collapse is coming tomorrow, and it does not mean the comparison is exact. Empires are not machines with fixed expiration dates, and history rarely repeats in a straight line. But patterns like this matter because they shape decisions, even when the people making those decisions do not consciously realize it. A country that senses its dominance slipping tends to act differently than one that feels secure in its position. It becomes more reactive, more sensitive to any sign of disrespect, more willing to take risks it might have avoided a generation earlier. Watch you! The tone of American foreign policy over just the last few years, and you can see some of that anxiety showing through, whether anyone in Washington would admit it out loud or not. Here is a number worth sitting with. Historically, the average lifespan of a major global empire is somewhere around 2.5 centuries. The American experiment was founded in 1776. Do the math, and you land almost exactly on the present moment. That is not a prophecy, and nobody should treat it as one. It is simply a pattern worth taking seriously, especially when you see real-world symptoms lining up with it. European allies quietly declining to fully join American-led coalitions. Gulf nations exploring separate, quieter arrangements with Iran to protect their own interests instead of relying entirely on American protection. A superpower struggling to guarantee something as basic as safe passage through the world's most important shipping lane. None of that looks like a system functioning at full strength. It looks like a system straining under weight it can no longer easily carry. There is another layer to this that almost nobody in the mainstream conversation is willing to say plainly. Even if both sides genuinely wanted this to end, neither one can actually stop. And the reason comes down to psychology as much as strategy. On the American side, there's a well-known school of thought in foreign policy circles built entirely around one idea, that any concession is read as weakness, and weakness invites more aggression, not less. Step back once, and your opponent advances twice. So you never step back, ever. Once a leader publicly declares that the other side has no navy, no air force, and no leadership left, accepting any deal that leaves that country's nuclear program intact, its key waterway still contested, and its military still functioning becomes politically impossible. That would look like a humiliating reversal, not a diplomatic win. The public framing locks the decision-maker into a corner of his own making. Now look at the other side. At the heart of Shia Islam sits a deep theology built around martyrdom. When a revered religious commander was killed in the strikes, that death was not experienced internally as a defeat. Within that framework, dying in defense of the faith is the highest possible honor, and it activates something close to a sacred obligation across an entire population. A joint statement from Iran's armed forces, released on the anniversary of a previous spiritual leader's death, which made the timing especially significant, declared that the nation would not retreat in the face of threats, and that its forces would defend the revolution to the very end. That is not political theater. That is a religious commitment, and commitments like that do not bend easily to outside pressure. One senior regional analyst put the logic plainly. Iran effectively has no choice but to respond to every strike, because any silence at all gets interpreted by its opponents as weakness, which only invites the next attack. So both sides are locked into the exact same trap from opposite directions. Backing down feels existentially dangerous to each of them inside their own political and religious frameworks. And because those two frameworks cannot be reconciled with each other, the cycle of escalation keeps repeating instead of ending. One former diplomat summarized the honest outlook bluntly: there will not be real peace here. At best, there might be an extended pause before the next round begins. Quick gut check before we go on. Type North Korea in the comments if you think Iran is following this exact playbook, or type different if you think this comparison breaks down somewhere. I actually read these, and it changes how I approach the next video on this. Now, before you assume I am simply taking Iran's side in all of this, let me argue against everything I just said, because that is only fair. The strongest counterargument goes something like this. Iran is not actually as powerful as this comparison makes it sound. North Korea is an isolated country with barely any presence in the global economy at all. Iran is different. It is under a real blockade. Its nuclear sites have been struck repeatedly. Millions of people have been displaced. Internally, inflation is running at levels most economies simply cannot sustain for long. And on pure military strength, America still holds an overwhelming advantage. Given enough time and enough pressure, the argument goes, Iran will eventually have no choice but to negotiate from a position of real weakness, because economic collapse usually comes before political collapse. That is a genuinely strong argument, and it deserves respect rather than dismissal. But it runs into a few serious problems. First, history shows almost no examples of a government voluntarily surrendering power while it is under active foreign attack. External pressure tends to unify a population around its government rather than fracture it, at least in the short and medium term. Iranian officials have claimed that even with millions displaced, essential distribution of basic goods has continued because state institutions adapted quickly rather than collapsing. Second, the more important question is not whether Iran is suffering, because it clearly is. The real question is whether the country applying the pressure can sustain that pressure indefinitely without paying an unbearable political price of its own back home. Rising fuel costs, a rapidly shrinking missile stockpile, and quiet defections from allied nations all eat away at how long any democracy can keep funding a war that produces no clean, decisive victory. And third, Iran's actual goal may not be winning in any conventional military sense at all. Its goal may simply be surviving long enough to finish building the same 4 pillars North Korea built. Every single day that passes without collapse, every barrel of oil sold outside the dollar system, every cheap drone that forces an expensive response, moves Iran one step closer to a position where confronting it directly is simply not worth the cost anymore. That is not losing a war. That is something closer to patience. And patience, historically, has outlasted stronger armies more than once. So where does that leave us? And what should you actually be watching for going forward? There are 3 signals worth paying close attention to. The first is any sign that Iran shifts from simply enriching uranium toward actually building and testing a working device. That single moment would change the entire equation overnight, because after it happens, no outside power could strike Iran militarily again without risking a response that could permanently choke off global energy supplies. The second signal is whether any major regional power quietly breaks away and strikes its own separate arrangement with Iran instead of relying on American protection. When a nation concludes that a foreign security umbrella cannot actually keep it safe, it moves to protect itself. It always has throughout history. And the third signal is whether a rising global power steps into this vacuum and proposes a new regional security structure that does not include the United States at all. If that happens, it would mark a turning point that is very difficult to reverse. None of what I have laid out today is meant to be treated as absolute truth carved in stone. It is a framework, a lens for looking at events that otherwise seem confusing and contradictory. And frameworks are only useful if you are willing to test them against reality and throw them out when they stop fitting. So if you think something here does not hold up, say so in the comments. That kind of pushback is genuinely how understanding improves over time for me and for everyone watching. So let's end with one simple question, because that is really all this comes down to. A powerful leader stood in front of a microphone and confidently declared that a rival nation had no navy worth mentioning, no functioning air force, no real leadership, and an economy in freefall. Judged purely by raw numbers, the comparison is not even wrong. The military gap between these two countries genuinely is enormous, but consider this before you accept the conclusion that follows from it. North Korea also has no navy that could compete on a global stage, no air force capable of matching a modern superpower, and an economy that has been broken for decades by any conventional measure. And yet the United States has never attacked North Korea, has never even come close, because the cost of doing so has always been judged too high to accept. So if the country in question really is as weak and as broken as it is being described, ask yourself the only question that actually matters here. Why, after everything that has already happened, has that promised victory still not arrived? Why is a missile stockpile already half empty against an enemy supposedly too weak to fight back? Why are allies quietly looking for their own arrangements instead of standing firmly behind the country that claims total dominance? Sit with that gap for a moment, the gap between the confident words being said out loud and the events actually unfolding in real time day after day. Because that gap, uncomfortable as it is, might be telling us the truest story of all. And once you start noticing gaps like that one, you will find it very hard to stop noticing them everywhere else too.